Okay. So yes, this particular task is about looking at legislation, government acts of legislation, regulations, and codes of practice. We have to cover all three in the criteria. Sometimes some of the things we look at fall into more than one category, but we have to make sure that we cover all three in some way, shape, or form. Perhaps we won't do this activity. This was an activity for the group, but I don't know. Perhaps as can you think of what piece of, just pick on one maybe when you're in your training room, when you're in your classroom, when you're teaching. What would be the top piece of legislation, regulation, or code of practice that affects what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Data protection.
Yep, that's a nice one. Yep, thanks, Hilary. I mean, it can be, it can be some regulations that relate to your topic. So, for example, if you're teaching electrical installation, it could be the, 17th edition wiring regulations would be probably top of your agenda, or in an engineering workshop or carpentry and joinery, the Health and Safety at Work Act might be top of your agenda. It very much depends on what you're doing.
Do you mean sort of we have to follow BTEC guidelines? Is that
yep,
part
BTEC
of that?
guidelines. Yep. BTEC code of practice. That'd be perfect. Yep.
So for my area then, Gary, we have HABIA, which is the codes of practice for the hair and beauty industry. So
perfect.
Put that one in.
Yep. That would be one. Yes. Yep. I guess there's clinical guidelines, Gemma, is there? Yeah. Okay, so I've listed a few. I'm sorry to say, Gemma, that they're all college related ones, but there might be some in there that that you might apply. So I've just picked off what's legislation. Anything that's got the word act behind it is a piece of legislation. So I've put in the Equality Act, which is a piece of legislation, and that affects us as trainers and teachers every day, really, because we need to make sure that we're including everybody, that we're promoting diversity, we're ensuring equality of access, we're supporting those that need support, we're providing different levels of support based on need. So the Equality Act, in the background, I suppose, but it kind of affects everything we do and everything we say in a training environment pretty much all of the time. So that would be a good one to include in there. Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015. You think, well, that's a strange one to have in there. It's got the word act behind it, so it's a piece of legislation, and it affects us all because part of the guidelines in there is prevent. So prevent is a code of practice. And I know that kind of affects your area as well, Gemma, because my partner Wendy's doing all of her online learning at the moment, and she was doing her sort of prevent module online the other evening. It's all moved on to a different system now. Was it ESL? Is it
ESR?
ESR, that's it. ESR. Yeah.
No, it's prevent is particularly long-winded and not very interesting, but yeah, we'll have to do the prevent training.
Yeah, she was. I was sitting. She was doing it here in the kitchen, and it was in far more detail and depth than we do at college. And I was really quite surprised about that, because I thought, we have contact with people for long periods of time, whereas you probably only have contact with patients for quite short periods of time. But I was really surprised at how in depth that training was.
I think a lot of it is surrounding. We have a lot of overseas staff.
Okay.
So we have a lot of staff from overseas. We have a lot of staff that come from other areas and other hospitals. So I think for us, it's more about watching your
colleagues,
staff members, rather than just patients.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. I never thought of that. But that's an example of a sort of a piece of legislation that you could use twice, because you know, the prevent guidelines, they are a code of practice, but they actually come from an act. So you could, if you want, use that twice as legislation and as a code of practice. GDPR regulations, of course, the data protection, health and safety at work acts, that applies to us all of the time. You know, it's higher on the agenda for some than others. You know, if you're teaching history in a general purpose classroom, then, you know, just checking that the furniture is safe and there's no trailing cables and things like that is enough. Whereas, you know, perhaps in a motor vehicles workshop where you've got students jacking up cars and laying underneath them, you know, and in electrical installation and things like that, where they're exposed to high risk, then you know, that's much higher up on the agenda for you. ESFA, which is the Education and Skills Funding Authority, we're bound by those every single day and every moment that we're at work. They don't impact on us too much, really, because it's pretty much Paul Whitehead and the MIS team that take care of all of that for us. But essentially, those regulations say what we can deliver and what we can't deliver, and what we get money for and what we don't get money for. So they do affect us in a big way, but probably don't have any impact really on our classroom practice. So that might not be relevant for you to put in there. There's the Education Training Foundation's Standards Code of Practice, which really says, you know, what a teacher should be doing in terms of their behaviours and their personal development. Again, probably the majority of teaching staff are completely unaware that those set of standards exist, but, you know, they're a nice one to include if you want to put them in there. And as you're saying, BTEC, I mean, not just BTEC, of course, every awarding organisation has a set of codes as code of practice, you know, so whoever you're with, EAL or City and Guilds, or the many awarding Gateway, many of the awarding organisations will have a code of practice and set of guidelines, usually running into pages and pages of documentation. And here's another one that you can use twice if you wanted to. There's the Children's Act, which is a piece of legislation because it's got the word act behind it. And a part of the Children's Act is safeguarding, the safeguarding guidelines, which is a code of practice. And I know Wendy was having to do that as well as part of her online training, as that was quite an in-depth module as well. At Harlow College, we've got a staff code of conduct. I'm sure anybody knows it exists, but there is there. It's on our cube, our intranet. There's a code of conduct, which is what we can do, what we can't do, how we should dress, how we should behave. And of course, then there's the Human Rights Act, which is a piece of legislation, a global piece of legislation, which we should, you know, all adhere to. We probably don't think too much about it on a day-to-day basis. So that's just some examples. In an ideal world, it'd be good if you could have 3 pieces of legislation, 3 regulations, and 3 codes of practice. But, you know, the lines are a bit blurry between them. So if you aim for kind of somewhere between around 6 pieces of work in there. The document you need is called Evidence 512. You'll find it under Learner Resources, Level 4 Certificate, Unit 5, Task B, and it's a Word document. It's a table, just like you've been working on now, and it looks like this. It's only 2 columns on it. In the first column, it says, what is the legislation or code of practice or regulation? So just make sure that the title in there of it is correct. You might need to do a search on there to make sure you've got the correct title for the legislation, regulation, or the code of practice. And then in here, what impact it has on your in the classroom, in your training room, in your teaching. You don't need to describe what it is. The main cause of me referring these back is people will write in here the Equality Act, and in here it says the Equality Act requires people to do X, Y, and Z. But, you know, think about how does it impact on your classroom practice? So if you put the Equality Act in there, it's about making sure that your training materials, you might say, okay, I need to check my training materials are representative of the diverse cultures that we live in and promote diversity, that there's no bias in them in any way, shape, or form. And I need to be constantly aware of the needs, the support needs of individuals within the group, and make sure that they're met. I need to make sure that any activities that I generate have a quality of access, that people can access them. So if people have got hearing impairments, visual impairments, or things like dyslexia, then they're provided with an appropriate alternative way of accessing the resources and materials. So there we go. So that's, I don't think there is anything else on that, is that? No, just complete that and that is it. Yeah, so that's all there is to that. It's just filling that in, just picking 3 pieces of legislation, 3 sets of regulations, and 3 codes of practice. Don't get overly hung up on how they fall out there, but if you just make sure that there are, what did I say, 6? I said 9 it should be, shouldn't it? 3 of each. 9. Maths never was my strong point, clearly. Okay, how does that sound? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, okay. Right, well, I'll stop the recording again there then, just so that Mark's got that little bit.